In the quaint town of Ravenhill, the autumn winds carried whispers of forgotten tales and lingering spirits. Among the town's youths were Emmy and Louisa, both 17, whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. They walked the same paths to school, shared secrets under the aged willows by the creek, and grew up under the watchful eyes of the town. Yet a silent chasm had grown between them, filled with unspoken words and hidden feelings. Louisa, with her fiery red hair and freckles, was known for her lively spirit and boundless curiosity. Emmy, on the other hand, was the quieter of the two, his thoughts often veiled behind deep blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. As the crisp October air began to fill Ravenhill, a certain restlessness took hold of Louisa. She watched Emmy from afar, noticing how he laughed less and stared more into the distance. She felt a gnawing sense that the childhood days they shared were slipping away, like leaves in the wind. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Louisa decided it was time to bridge the gap. She found Emmy sitting alone at their old haunt by the creek, the water murmuring secrets as it flowed. Gathering every ounce of courage, she sat beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Emmy," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." Emmy turned, his expression unreadable. She took a deep breath. I think I love you, Emmy. I've felt this way for a long time." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emmy looked at her, his eyes filled with a complexity of emotions that Louisa couldn't decipher. Finally he spoke, his voice gentle yet distant. "Louisa, you're my best friend, but I don't feel the same way." His words fell like cold rain, dousing the fiery hope in Louisa's heart. Heartbroken, Louisa ran back home under the cover of darkness, her tears mingling with the cold drizzle that had begun to fall. That night the seed of obsession took root in her shattered heart. She couldn't accept Emmy's rejection. It echoed in her mind, a relentless torment that pushed her towards the edge of reason. Days turned into weeks, and Louisa's pain transformed into an obsession. She began following Emmy, lurking in the shadows, watching his every move with a desperate intensity. Her heart twisted every time she saw him smile, laugh, live, all while ignoring her. Unable to bear the pain, Louisa turned to the old ways, the forgotten magic whispered about in Ravenhill's darker corners. She sought out Madame Morrow, an enigmatic figure known for her knowledge of ancient spells and potions. Under the cloak of night, Louisa met her at the old windmill on the outskirts of town. The windmill groaned under the weight of years, its shadows alive with whispered incantations. "Help me," Louisa pleaded, her voice a mix of desperation and determination. "Make him love me as I love him." Madame Morrow, her eyes sharp and knowing, handed Louisa a small heart-shaped bottle filled with a potion. "This is a powerful love spell, child, but be warned, the heart cannot be compelled without consequence." Louisa ignored the warning, blinded by her need. She tried everything to make Emmy love her, slipping potions into his drinks, chanting spells under the moonlight, even leaving enchanted tokens under his doorstep. But nothing worked. Emmy remained oblivious to her torments, his heart guarded against her magic. Driven to despair, Louisa's spirit broke. One stormy night, when the wind howled like the cries of the forsaken, Louisa walked into the raging river by their childhood haunt, her heart heavy with unrequited love. As the waters swallowed her, a spectral transformation began. Louisa's earthly ties severed, her spirit condemned to the shadows. Emmy, unbeknownst to the tragic fate of his once dearest friend, continued his life, shadowed by a feeling of unease he couldn't explain. Little did he know, Louisa's spirit lingered, her ghostly presence a constant echo in his life, watching, waiting. Her love turned into a haunting, tethering her to him in death as she couldn't in life. And so began a spectral vigil, a haunting born of a heartbroken spell, waiting for the moment to be freed by a true love yet unseen. In Ravenhill, the autumn nights grew longer and the shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to stretch and twist into unsettling forms. Emmy found himself increasingly uneasy, a sensation of being watched seeping into his every waking moment and invading his dreams. The air around him felt charged, as if a storm was perpetually on the horizon, yet the skies remained clear. Emmy began to notice odd occurrences around his home. Objects would move slightly from where he left them, and he would catch glimpses of something or someone in the periphery of his vision. At night, he heard the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway, always retreating when he turned on the light. His sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams of Louisa calling to him from the depths of murky waters, her eyes hollow and pleading. One evening, as Emmy sat reading in his living room, the lights flickered and dimmed to a haunting glow. The air grew cold, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He looked up, his heart pounding, and saw a figure at the edge of the room. It was Louisa, or rather, a ghastly version of her. Her figure was translucent, tinged with the blue of deep water, her eyes dark pools reflecting a sorrow so deep it was palpable. "Emmy," the apparition whispered, her voice a chilling breeze that seemed to echo around the room. "Emmy, why won't you love me back?" Emmy recoiled, his chair clattering to the ground as he backed away. "Louisa, is that really you?" he stammered, unable to reconcile the girl he once knew with the spectral figure before him. The ghostly Louisa drifted closer, her form blurring at the edges. "I've tried everything, Emmy. Why can't you feel the same? Why?" Her voice rose in a crescendo of anguish that rattled the windows. Panic surged through Emmy, his rational mind struggling to grasp the reality of his dead friend haunting him. "Louisa, I'm sorry, but I can't love you the way you want. Please, you have to move on." The spirit of Louisa seemed to tremble, a sad, eerie wail escaping her as she faded away, leaving behind a cold silence that hung heavily in the room. Emmy, shaken, knew he needed help. He couldn't face this alone. The next day, he visited the local library, diving into old tomes and dusty manuscripts, searching for anything on ghosts and unrequited spirits. He learned of old rituals for banishing spirits and tales of souls trapped between worlds due to unresolved earthly ties. But everything pointed to one grim solution. The spirit needed to resolve its earthly business, or someone must help release it. Determined to find another way, Emmy contacted Nihan, a girl he knew from school renowned for her knowledge of supernatural lore. Nihan was a skeptic, but had a keen interest in the paranormal, her logical mind intrigued by the mysteries she couldn't explain. "Emmy, spirits that linger usually have unfinished business," Nihan explained as they met under the twisted limbs of an old oak in the town square. "If Louisa is haunting you, it's because she's tied to something unresolved. Maybe she needs to know you truly cared, just not in the way she wanted. But how can I show her that? She won't listen. She's consumed by her emotions, her obsession," Emmy replied, frustration and fear mingling in his voice. "We need to find a way to communicate with her, to make her understand and accept the truth. Maybe then she can find peace," Nihan suggested, her tone serious. That night, they prepared a ritual to contact Louisa's spirit. They set up in Emmy's living room, where most of the hauntings occurred. Candles flickered as they formed a circle with salt, and Nihan began chanting softly, an incantation meant to protect them and invite the spirit to communicate. The air grew icy, and the candles sputtered as a form began to coalesce in the center of the circle. The ghost of Louisa appeared, her expression one of deep sadness and longing. "Louisa," Nihan spoke firmly, "you need to hear Emmy out. He cares for you, but not in the way you want. You have to let go." The spirit wavered, her gaze fixed on Emmy, a torrent of emotions crossing her spectral face. Emmy stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "Louisa, I always cared about you as my friend. Please find peace. You deserve rest, not this torment." The room fell silent as the spirit of Louisa looked at Emmy, her form slowly beginning to dissolve into the air, a soft sigh the only sound marking her departure. But the peace was short-lived. As the candles flickered one last time, a dark, malevolent force stirred in the shadows. unspoken and unseen, awakened by the rituals and ready to claim what was unsettled. The true horror had only just begun. As the last echo of Louisa's ghostly sigh faded into the chilling silence of Emmy's living room, an ominous atmosphere descended upon the circle of salt and candles. Nihan and Emmy exchanged a glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of the dread that had suddenly thickened the air around them. The ritual, intended to bring closure, seemed instead to have opened a darker doorway. "Did you feel that?" Nihan whispered, her eyes scanning the dim corners of the room where shadows seemed to cling a little too persistently. "Yes," Emmy replied, his voice barely audible. "It's like we're not alone anymore." As they hurried to extinguish the candles and erase the circle, a cold gust of wind slammed the windows shut, plunging the room into darkness. The faint moonlight filtering through the curtains cast ghostly patterns on the walls, and for a moment the silence was complete. Then the soft, sinister whisper of laughter trickled through the room, a sound neither of them could place as human or otherworldly. "This isn't Louisa," Nihan said, reaching for her bag where she kept her collection of occult tools and texts. "We've stirred something else, something older and more malevolent." Emmy paced nervously, every creak of the house sounding like a warning. "What do we do now? We can't just call out to whatever this is." Nihan pulled out a small, leather-bound book, her fingers flipping through the pages rapidly. "There's a sealing ritual here. It's supposed to contain whatever spirit or entity has been awakened, but it requires—" Before she could finish, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, as if every piece of china had been hurled to the floor simultaneously. Both of them jumped, hearts racing, as the malevolent presence made itself known with increasing violence. With no time to lose, Nihan quickly outlined the steps of the ritual. "We need to form a new circle, this time with iron filings. It's stronger, meant to hold more potent spirits." Working together, they spread a line of iron filings around themselves, the metallic scent filling the air. Nihan resumed her chanting, her voice steady despite the growing cacophony of bangs and crashes from all over the house. Emmy watched, his every sense alert, as the temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the icy air. Suddenly the center of the room seemed to darken, coalescing into a dense, shadowy mass. The entity, whatever it was, had entered their circle, drawn by the ritual. It was a swirling vortex of darkness, absorbing all light, all warmth. The edges of the iron filings glowed faintly red, the only barrier keeping the darkness at bay. "Do not break the circle," Nihan instructed, her eyes fixed on the book. "No matter what happens." The entity pulsed, as if breathing, and with each contraction a wave of despair washed over them. Images flashed in Emmy's mind, horrific scenes of other times and places, of violence and sorrow, all emanating from this dark force. He struggled to focus, to maintain his grip on reality as the entity tested their defenses. Nihan's voice grew louder, more forceful. The air crackled with energy, the iron filings sparking intermittently. Then, with a deafening screech that seemed to shake the foundations of the house, the entity recoiled, the darkness dissipating as suddenly as it had appeared. Breathing heavily, Nihan closed her book. "It's done. For now, it's contained. But this was a warning. We can't keep opening doors we don't understand." Emmy nodded, the weight of their encounter settling in his bones. "What was that? It was like nothing I've ever felt." "It's old, Emmy. Old and angry. Whatever it is, it's been here waiting. Louisa's ritual might have weakened the barriers holding it back." As they cleaned up, both felt the unspoken fear that this was far from over. The entity had retreated, but it had not been banished. It lurked in the darker corners of Ravenhill, in the whispers of the wind, in the shadows of their nightmares. And as they left Emmy's house, the lingering cold reminded them that some doors, once opened, might never be closed again. In the days that followed, Ravenhill seemed cloaked in a perpetual twilight, the sun rarely breaking through the heavy leaden clouds that hung low in the sky. Emmy and Nihan, still reeling from their encounter with the malevolent entity, felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them wherever they went. The town itself appeared to be succumbing to a silent dread, its residents speaking in hushed tones, their glances darting nervously to the shadows. Despite their efforts to resume normal life, both Emmy and Nihan knew they were marked by the darkness they had unwittingly unleashed. Emmy especially found little solace in his once peaceful home, now a place of restless shadows and unexplained noises that mimicked the living. Whispers without source, footsteps where no feet tread. One evening, as Emmy lay in bed trying to find sleep, the air in his room grew oppressively thick, choking him with the foul stench of decay. He sat up, gasping, his eyes darting around the darkened room. It was then he saw it, faint at first, but growing steadily clearer, the figure of a man, old and decrepit, his eyes hollow pits of despair, staring intently at Emmy from the foot of his bed. Emmy's heart raced, his breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The figure remained silent, its gaze never wavering. Then, with a voice that sounded like the grinding of earth, it spoke, its words a chilling echo in the still room. "The keeper of sorrows, the harbinger of decay. You have opened the gates, young one, and they will not easily be closed." The room seemed to constrict around Emmy, the walls inching closer, the shadows deepening. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "The balance has been tipped," it continued. "That which has been bound must be freed, or more will follow." Fighting back his fear, Emmy demanded, "What do you want from us?" "Restitution," the figure hissed. "A return to the old ways, or the darkness will consume all. You have stirred the ancient ones and they are hungry." Before Emmy could respond, the figure dissipated like smoke, leaving behind a cold that seeped into his bones. The next day, Emmy met Nihan at the local cafe, their usual meeting spot now feeling like a small sanctuary amid the encroaching darkness. He recounted the night's visitation, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. Nihan listened intently, her brow furrowed. "This is beyond anything I've studied. If what that spirit said is true, we're dealing with something ancient, something that was here long before this town." "We need help," Emmy said, desperation edging his voice. "We can't handle this on our own." Nihan agreed, and together they decided to seek out Madame Morrow, the enigmatic woman who had unwittingly started this nightmare with Louisa's love spell. They found her in her usual haunt, the old windmill on the outskirts of town, its blades creaking ominously in the wind. Madame Morrow listened to their tale with an inscrutable expression, her eyes reflecting a knowledge far deeper than they had suspected. "You have indeed awakened something that should have remained asleep," she said, her voice grave. "This entity, this keeper of sorrows, is but a herald of deeper darknesses. What can we do?" Nihan asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "There is a way," Madame Morrow replied slowly, "but it comes with great risk. To close the door you have opened, you must enter the abyss itself. You must face the ancient ones in their domain and convince them to retreat." Emmy and Nihan exchanged a look of dread. The prospect of venturing into such a realm was terrifying, but the alternative, leaving their town, their homes, to the mercy of creeping shadows and ancient wrath, was unthinkable. Madame Morrow handed them an old leather-bound map, its lines marked with symbols that made little sense to them. "This will guide you to the entrance of the abyss. Be warned, the path is perilous, and many who have walked it did not return." With the map clutched tightly in his hand, Emmy felt the weight of their task settle upon his shoulders. Together, they stepped out from the windmill, the creaking of the blades sounding like a dirge for their forthcoming journey into darkness. With the ancient map leading the way, Emmy and Nihan ventured into the deep woods surrounding Ravenhill, a place where the trees grew so tall and dense they seemed to absorb both sound and light. The path, barely visible beneath the tangle of overgrown roots and thick underbrush, twisted deeper into the forest, taking them far from any trace of civilization. The air grew colder as they progressed, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Every step forward was met with resistance, as if the forest itself was alive, aware of their mission, and reluctant to let them pass. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of their vision, whispering voices calling out in languages forgotten by time, urging them to turn back. As the sun set, casting the woods into an eerie twilight, they reached a clearing. In its center stood a stone circle, ancient and moss-covered, with runes etched deep into each monolith. According to the map, this was the gateway to the abyss, the entrance to the realm of the Ancient Ones. Nihan set up candles around the perimeter of the stone circle, each flame flickering against the encroaching darkness. She pulled out a small book of incantations, her voice trembling slightly as she began to read aloud. The words seemed to resonate with the stones, causing them to hum with a deep primal energy. As Emmy watched, the center of the circle began to distort, the air shimmering as if heated by an unseen fire. A dark void appeared, swirling with shadows that reached out like tendrils into the night. The boundary between their world and the abyss had been opened. "This is it," Emmy said, his voice barely a whisper. "We go in, we find the Ancient Ones, and we convince them to close the door." Nihan nodded, her face set with determination. "We stay together, no matter what happens." Hand in hand, they stepped into the void. The darkness enveloped them completely, extinguishing the candlelight and muffling the sounds of the forest until there was nothing but oppressive silence. They walked through the abyss, guided only by the faint glow of the runes on the map. The path through the abyss was fraught with horrors. Phantoms of the past, twisted creatures of shadow and despair, roamed the darkness. They encountered souls trapped in eternal torment, their cries echoing around them, begging for release or tempting them to despair. Every step forward was a battle against the overwhelming urge to flee or fall into madness. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the heart of the abyss, a vast cavern where the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. At its center, seated on thrones of bone and shadow, were the Ancient Ones. Their forms were indistinct, shifting between human and monstrous, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Emmy stepped forward, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We have come to plead for our world. You were awakened by mistake, by rituals forgotten by time. We ask you to close the door that has been opened." The Ancient Ones watched them, their presence oppressive and immense. After a moment of silence, one of them spoke, its voice like the grinding of stone. "Why should we heed the call of mortals? The door has been opened, the balance disrupted. What can you offer for such a boon?" Nihan, quick to respond, pulled from her bag a small, sealed vial containing a glowing essence. "We offer this spirit essence, a rare and powerful substance collected from the boundary of life and death." The Ancient Ones murmured among themselves, their interest piqued. "And what of your own essences? Would you sacrifice yourselves for your cause?" Emmy and Nihan exchanged a grim look. The stakes were higher than they had anticipated, and the choice was stark: sacrifice or eternal darkness. With a heavy heart, Emmy spoke, his decision clear. "If it is our essence you require, then you shall have it, but only if you swear to seal the door and retract your shadows from our world." A silence fell over the cavern, the tension palpable. Finally, the Ancient Ones nodded, a gesture of acceptance. As the pact was sealed, a blinding light filled the cavern, the force of the ancient magic overwhelming. Emmy and Nihan braced themselves, ready to pay the price for the safety of their world, as the essence of their very beings began to be drawn forth, a sacrifice to mend the broken balance and close the door to the abyss forever. As the light engulfed them, Emmy and Nihan felt the essence of their beings slowly being extracted, an excruciating process that tethered their spirits to the very fabric of the abyss. The Ancient Ones, their forms now clearer and more formidable in the brightening glow, watched with an intensity that felt as if it could shatter souls. Emmy held Nihan's hand tightly, the last bastion of his humanity in the swirling chaos of the void. Their physical forms began to wane, becoming translucent, as if they were dissolving into the very air around them. The pain was unimaginable, yet beneath it lay a profound sense of purpose. They were the barrier against the encroaching darkness, the final line that would hold or break. As their essences were drawn out, the cavern around them began to change. The bones and shadows that formed the thrones of the Ancient Ones started to crumble, signifying the old powers receding, their hold on the mortal world weakening. The air lightened, a sign that the door between the worlds was beginning to close. But in this pivotal moment of sacrifice, something unexpected stirred within the shadow. A dark, sentient force, separate from the Ancient Ones yet nourished by the same abyssal energy, began to coalesce. It was a shadow born from the darkest fears of humanity, a culmination of all the nightmares and horrors that had ever been and would ever be. This shadow entity, seeing the threat to its existence from the closing of the door, surged forward in a desperate bid to escape the collapsing realm. It was a melange of writhing darkness, seeking to anchor itself in the only sources of light left in the abyss, Emmy and Nihan. As the entity approached, Nihan, with the last of her strength and clarity, realized the imminent danger. "Emmy," she gasped, her voice echoing strangely in the thinning air of the abyss. "We can't let it escape. We have to contain it here." Understanding flashed in Emmy's eyes. With a nod, they tightened their grip on each other, their remaining essence flaring out to confront the shadow. Their light met the dark in a cataclysmic clash, sparks of pure energy scattering throughout the cavern. The battle was fierce and brief. Emmy and Nihan, their lives already forfeit to the pact, poured every shred of their beings into the fight. The light and darkness twisted and roared, a storm of cosmic proportions that shook the foundations of the abyss. Finally, with a tremendous effort that used the last of their spiritual energy, they managed to encapsulate the shadow within a cocoon of their combined essence. The entity thrashed and howled, trapped by the very power it sought to devour. As the last of their visible forms disappeared, the Ancient Ones solemnly declared the pact fulfilled. The door to the abyss shuddered, and then sealed shut with a resounding boom that echoed through the now still cavern. Back in Ravenhill, the immediate threat over, the darkness that had begun to seep into the town receded as mysteriously as it had appeared. The shadows withdrew, the air cleared, and for a moment, the town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. However, in the heart of the forest, where the stone circle lay quiet and abandoned, a faint glimmer of light persisted within the center of the stones. The spirits of Emmy and Nihan, now guardians of the threshold, remained bound to the abyss, forever watching over the sealed door. Their sacrifice had saved their world, but at the cost of their freedom, their future, their very lives. As tales of their bravery and sacrifice spread, a new kind of whisper traveled through Ravenhill. Stories of the guardians who held the darkness at bay, a bittersweet legend of love, loss, and eternal vigilance. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees and the night was at its darkest, one could hear the echoes of a soft, sad melody, a reminder of the price paid and the shadows forever waiting just beyond the light.